All right, how is everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel. We do educational videos here, and we try to check out great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, cosmology, but also tour de forces and magnum opuses and earth-shattering discoveries, most of them from obscure sources. And today is our 260th video on the unit that we've got called the Reciprocal Church, named in honor of Dewey B. Larson and his great reciprocal system of theory, another, I think, the greatest modern all grand unified theory. He unites all of the fields, all the major fields of science, and also science with religion. And this is where the religion comes in. We're looking at different kind of magnum opuses, works, lifelong works that people embarked upon despite them getting no remuneration, no exposure, but just because they were pursuing truth. And we are in particular looking at kind of the people who've done that in a spiritual manner, like that have proposed things that will help you get closer to the divine, however you see that, your heart, the divine spark within you. And we've looked at quite a few different forms of that, and we're going to be looking at some more. But we feel that this is imperative because we recognize that the major religions are on a collision course, or a collision course with the ground. They've been thrown out of a window and they just haven't landed yet, because there's a lot of evidence out there that destroys them. And we're looking at that in particular with regard to the New Testament today. We're looking at the work of Michael Menescotz, M-E-N-A-S-G-O-T-Z. And he has a new book out called Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. The Flavians were the dynasty of Caesars from 69 to 96 AD, which included Vespasian and his two sons, Titus and Domitian. And Menescotz is certainly not the first author to conclude that the New Testament was written by the Romans, the Caesars. They were the only people during this time that were writing anything. They had full control of the press. They had full control of the dissemination of any type of publishing. Nobody else knew how to read or write, basically. And so a very big red flag should be when you recognize that the New Testament originally came out in Greek. That certainly doesn't lend a whole lot of credence to it coming out of a bunch of semi-literate Aramaic speakers from Palestine or Judea, because the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament emanated from Rome. The author was probably a group effort, but I think the core of the authorship is a character named Josephus, who you know of because he is actually the only writer from the first century, other than the New Testament, that even mentions the existence of Jesus. And so Christians will cite his name as a corroborating witness to Jesus's existence, but it really cuts the other way. You can cite that, but if you really read Josephus and his 7 books called the Jewish War, or War of the Jews, and that's the war from 66 to 73 AD, you will recognize that whoever wrote War of the Jews also wrote the Gospels. And Menescotz demonstrates that in his book. Now, I don't believe that a character named Josephus existed, but even according to his autobiography, he was a member of the Roman royal family by adoption. He was known as Flavius Josephus, after the Flavian Caesars, because they adopted him once he was pardoned. Vespasian pardoned him. He was one of the military generals for the Jews, and Vespasian he defected to Rome, and then he predicted Vespasian would one day become emperor. Vespasian at that time was just a general, and when Vespasian became emperor, he adopted him into his family and brought him to Rome as one of the court historians. And really, all of the people who, even in the 2nd century, who mentioned the existence of Jesus, like Tacitus and Trajan, Suetonius, and Pliny the Younger, they're all Roman royals also. They're either were Caesars or were very, very close relatives of Caesar. And so there is no other evidence of Christianity or the name of Jesus other than those 5 sources in the first 2 centuries AD. So, Christians will use that, but then when you recognize that these people are all coming from Rome, then that becomes problematic. So what Menescotts does in his book is he sets up a graph where he puts the book of Luke, the 3rd gospel, which has 24 chapters, on the vertical axis. And he puts Wars of the Jews, all 694 paragraphs, on the horizontal axis. And then he searches, which took about 4 years, he searched for parallels between the 2 books. There's a lot of different categories of parallels, but a general idea, one major one, is the things that Jesus predicts or prophesies in the New Testament are fulfilled by Titus, the general, and then the emperor. Titus was first, he's the son of Vespasian. When Vespasian became emperor, he promoted Titus to the head general. Then when Vespasian died, Titus became the emperor. But Titus is the second coming of Jesus. If you read these 2 texts, what is predicted by Jesus is fulfilled by Titus. Not only that, but the exact location where Jesus makes the prediction is the exact location where Titus fulfills the prediction. Jesus makes the prediction in symbolic or as a parable language, and Titus fulfills the prophecy literally. Jesus makes a prediction, and Titus fulfills it often 40 years to the day from the time that Jesus made the prediction. So if you are waiting for the second coming of Jesus and you're all up in the book of Revelation thinking that the second coming is happening, it happened 1950 years ago. And the second coming, his name was Emperor Titus. I can't remember any of Titus's other names, but yeah. And so, but it doesn't just work that way. Some of in this case, many of those, they go both ways. Sometimes War of the Jews is parodying the Gospels. Sometimes the Gospels is parodying War of the Jews. The parallels go back and forth. And then sometimes they throw in a third text, a lot of times from the Old Testament, like, for example, Exodus 12, which is the Passover ritual. That is employed in both books, and you have to kind of look at all 3 of them at the same time. In other words, this is coming in code, and you have to be able to decode it. Now, the motive for the Romans to do this, because they had the motive, the means, and the opportunity and the resources to do this, and they were the only group of people who had that, as well as the language resources and the educational chops to be able to do this, which the people that wrote that we think wrote it didn't really. Luke might have been some kind of doctor, but he was probably not classically trained in Greek, which is apparently what Greek scholars think of the New Testament, that it was written in a very high classical form. I'm trying to remember where I was going with that. So what he does is when he finds these parallels, he plots a point. He puts a point there. The motive. The motive is that the Jews were a pain in the side of the Romans for over 100 years now. Judea is a colony of Rome, or a province of Rome, and they had all these puppet kings called the Herods that kind of ruled for them. And the Herods were partially Jewish, but they married into the Roman family, and they probably helped out because they were at Rome. They abandoned the Jews when the siege of Jerusalem started happening, and they moved to Rome. So these Herods were all there, so they knew the scripture, the Old Testament scriptures. So they could have definitely helped out with writing the New Testament. But the motive was really the Jews were such a pain in the side of the Romans for so long, culminating up into this Jewish war, 66 to 73 AD, which was very, very costly for the Romans. And the Jews were very, very zealous. They were willing to die, and they were willing to be tortured to, hold on to their traditions and their faith. And that's what the Romans had to do to win. And so they figured that they would try a piece of psychological operation on the Jews, a wartime propaganda, by proposing a Jewish hero, a Jewish savior, a Jewish Messiah, who was a Prince of Peace, who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, who believed in turning the other cheek on oppression, who believed in walking an extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack on his back, and who believed in the faith of the Roman slave owner as the greatest in all of Judea. And so, they tried to get the Jews hooked on this Jesus character, and then pull away the rug at a certain point and point that actually Jesus is predicting his second coming, and his second coming is Titus. And so eventually you recognize that the real God of the New Testament is Titus. And the whole psyop is very, very mean-spirited, mocking, degrading, violent, cannibalistic, pornographic, once you decode it. These people, these Romans, you have to recognize that the Roman Caesars were like the most debauched people in the history of Western civilization. These are the worst people possible to have written your Gospels and your entire New Testament. So the Gospels basically were written targeting the Jews. The epistles of Paul were written in a later period as opposed to an earlier period, which scholars say. They were written in a later period, and they were written by Pliny the Younger, who was basically a foster brother of the character who wrote under the name of Josephus, who was known as Arius Piso. And the epistles of Paul were really targeted toward the Gentiles, the soldiers, the slaves of Rome. And so we're going to look at some of the parallels that Menescot's arrives at, and we can see for ourselves whether we think they are strong parallels or whether they're just coincidences. But I'll have to tell you that going over these he found over 250 parallels just in the book of Luke. And when he graphed them on the chart, they make 5 Latin letters, APTVS. So they don't make a random pattern. What this basically is showing you is it's showing you that the Romans, the Caesars, they signed their name to the book of Luke. So not only did they leave behind all these parallels, but these parallels signed their name. And so once this evidence, and there's so much collateral damage of this evidence that just destroys so much other stuff in Western civilization, that, including Josephus, who's supposed to be known as really like one of the great historians of all time, when we recognize that he's just part of a psyop. So that takes out another pillar of Western civilization. It will eventually will also take out Judaism, Islam. It will take out a great deal of the literature from this, from the history of all the way through, and obviously the Catholic Church. Okay, let's look at this next parallel. So this is from paragraph 680 in Jewish War, book 7, chapter 2, paragraph 4. This discusses Cleopatra as the threat that arose from Egypt. The Queen of the South rises up, who often spoke with Mark Antony to convince him to cut off Herod. And he says, like, in parentheses, acting with a man to condemn him. But as a result, Herod built up Masada, which is a fortress in the south of Judea, leaving it for the finishing stroke of the Romans. And then he goes back to Jewish War. I don't really like when he hops around paragraphs. Makes it seem a little bit more contrived, but he goes back to Jewish War 549 and 552 and 627. That's book 5, chapter 2, paragraph 4, book 5, chapter 5, paragraph 1, and book 6, chapter 4, paragraph 8. All these passages describe how Solomon laid the foundation of Jerusalem, and later how the Romans rip it to pieces so that nothing remained. So this finishing stroke involves the Romans arriving and undoing Solomon's work. So kind of implying that one greater than Solomon is here. Now the parallel verse is just from the book of Luke, chapter 11, verse 31. The Queen of the South shall rise up in the judgment with the men of this generation and condemn them. For she came from the utmost parts of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And behold, a greater than Solomon is here. Now, I would say that that is certainly a parallel, but it's quite well hidden, and it's not the best one that I've seen, or even close. But I would give it credit for being a parallel. Queen of the South, finishing stroke for the Romans, greater than Solomon, rising up and condemning them. So those are all in both of those parallels, but you know, he kind of had to bend over backwards to put them together. Now again, there's 250 parallels, so you can't really expect all of them to be strong. Some of them are very obvious, others of them are less so, especially in the first 2 books of Josephus, and some of them are totally devastating though. We'll see how many there are that are really totally devastating. I think I've seen about 5 so far out of maybe like 50 that we've gone through. Okay, whilst the reference to the rising of the famous Queen of the South is a perfectly adequate parallel for purposes of adding a dot or star on the chart, the overcoming of Solomon is a more significant message. Since Solomon built the Holy Temple in Jerusalem and Titus destroyed it, the message is partly that Titus is greater than Solomon. Elsewhere, Jesus prophesies that the fall of Jerusalem would reveal his second coming. And here, greater than Solomon is here. Adds a different angle, implying that the arrival of a great person is not merely revealed by the fall of Jerusalem, but actually is the person who undoes Solomon's temple building. Okay, now we go to the next one, which is also very short. Jewish War, paragraph 660, book 7, chapter 5, paragraph 1. And I say these because you can easily download a copy of Josephus, a PDF, and you can follow along at home. Make sure that it is up to your standards. You can fill out the chart on your own. Get a piece of graph paper and mark up the graph paper and make sure that the APTVS pattern is legit. And he does that periodically in this book. He stops and says, okay, now let's plot these points. And he shows you the new points. Now, if you can see the graph just in general in the thumbnail on this video, the APTVS pattern. Okay, so now Jewish War 660. Titus saw the Sabbatic river, which only flows on the 7th day of each week and otherwise runs dry. Now, this is supposed to be a history. Josephus is considered to be one of the great historians of all time. And I think his book is like one of the greatest selling books of all time, like right below the New Testament itself. But he says that there is a river which only flows on the 7th day of each week and otherwise runs dry. Like, you expect me to believe that? This is obviously, there's a different motive here. This is a parenthetical. He says, Titus observes watering happening in a divine fashion on the Sabbath, as if to imply that God considers taking action of the Sabbath to be acceptable. And then he goes to Luke 13, chapter 13, verse 15. Jesus was accused of breaking the Sabbath by healing the sick, but he accused the Jews of hypocrisy, saying they lead their ox or ass from the stall to watering on the Sabbath. So basically meaning watering on the Sabbath, suggesting work on the Sabbath is acceptable. Okay, I'd say it's a parallel, but, again, pretty weak. It always impresses me that historians are content to take Jewish war at its word, just what I was saying. So many stories within it are plainly fiction, and this is a perfect example. There's clearly no such thing as a natural river that would flow every 7th day, only every 7th day. Indeed, there is nothing in nature that operates on a 7-day cycle at all. But as with so many of the previous parallels, there is a hidden message, which is that God approves of taking action on the Sabbath, contrary to the Jewish laws which prohibit it. And that's one thing that's very much built into the New Testament, is this erosion of the Mosaic law. In fact, Jesus in the New Testament, he only really sanctions like 5 of the 10 commandments. And between him and Paul, they whittle away at a lot of Jewish law. Circumcision, kind of the separatism of Jews, animal sacrifice. These things are all abandoned. And really, even eventually, the graven images and kosher laws, kosher food laws, these are all jettisoned by Christianity. So that's another motive that the Romans had. Because they wanted the Jews to assimilate to their empire. And all of these things, and even really monotheism in general, because Christianity goes with this Trinity, so that chips away at the monotheism, which is one of the major blockages that the Romans had to getting the Jews to assimilate. So you can see the motives just from the results, or from the text. Okay, why would Titus want to end this practice of abstaining from work on the Sabbath? Whilst the intended audience may have included commoners and slaves, it definitely included Jews and soldiers of the legions. Of course, the Flavians might have seen abstention of work on the Sabbath as a drain on the empire's economic productivity. But I think their bigger concern would be to prevent the legions adopting the Jewish commandments and thus not working on the Sabbath. That would make them refuse to march or fight on Saturdays, clearly disastrous in wartime. So once again, we can see the objectives of the Flavian emperors almost transparent in the messages the author is promoting. So that's pretty much what I just said. I think he was a little bit more articulate with it, but I'll give him some credit, but he probably spent 5 minutes working on the paragraph and I just spit it out. But, it's not a competition. I think we both agree on this. I pause here to plot the latest parallels I have described. And so let me see. I'm going to try to find the next page. This is the end of this page. But there are... let's see. It's kind of an adventure to flip the page. There's so much information on one page, though, that I go through this about the pace of 1 page per day. And I know I do a lot of rambling. And there's an incredible amount of information that has to be conveyed, every episode, because just to give the context, because it's a little bit complicated. Okay. So now we see the parallels. Most of these parallels are in the S of the APTVS pattern. So they're way over in books 6 and 7 of Josephus and kind of scattered throughout Luke, because Luke is on the vertical axis. But again, those are mostly on the far right side of the pattern. With these latest parallels, the S is starting to come into focus slightly. Even though these are beginning to deviate from the diagonal, it's possible that some of them, specifically the ones where Luke parodies Jewish war, were going to be revealed to the mid-level initiates of the secrecy cult. And so his hypothesis is basically what I just said, that you start out with Jesus as a hero, then you move to Jesus as a Messiah or Savior, then you move to Jesus as just the precursor, predicting the existence of Titus. And then it's revealed to you that the Gospels are fiction, and you move over to what he calls pure emperor worship. So that's how he sees the progression of the secrecy cult, kind of like the Masons or something. You go, kind of one step at a time, deeper and deeper into the cult. And you have to pass certain tests before you're revealed. The next level is revealed to you. So he says that this was going to be revealed to the mid-level initiates of the secrecy cult, who are being encouraged to see Titus as the second coming of Jesus. I mentioned at the beginning of this chapter that I would mainly focus on parallels in which a particular location in Luke is being parodied by multiple locations in Jewish war, but I didn't explain why. I would like to know. One interesting aspect of such a one-to-many parallel is that it is immediately fairly obvious which is parodying which. For a critic seeking to find a hole in my mutual parodies logic by arguing that only Luke is parodying the other document, this poses a huge difficulty. How could single locations in Luke possibly mirror multiple locations in Jewish War that all align with the APTVS pattern, unless Jewish War was edited to enable this? It's clearly impossible. Another reason that these one-to-many parallels are interesting is that it raises the prospect that some specific group of parallels was intended to be shown first to quickly generate an outline of the APTVS pattern, in which case these many-to-one parallels would certainly have been among them. Okay, I think we're going to stop there. He's moving to another section here, and we're going to be getting into, I think, a little bit of more complicated parallels, which I kind of prefer, but now I see why he's doing multiple parallels, multiple parallels from Jewish War, but it becomes a little bit cumbersome, and it kind of messes with the pattern. I like the parallels that are just one verse versus one verse, but maybe that's just because I'm more of a simpleton with this stuff. But I'm not like a decoding decipherer. But so the next section is called Zacharias as a pun on A to Z of the gods. And so if I remember correctly, Zacharias is the father of John the Baptist. And I believe that Menescot's gets to the point where he also intimates that he is also the father of Jesus, because Mary goes and stays with Zacharias and his wife, who I can't remember her name, for like 3 months, and then she leaves and she begins showing that she's pregnant. So anyway, I'm sure he'll get into that, and we'll talk about that in future episodes. But thanks for tuning in today, and we'll be picking up where we left off tomorrow. So come back, and please have a great day.